Good morning. Please sit down.
Application 1 of 2017 Commissioners for Motion, General Order Section 68.
Yes, good morning. We indicated that we would adjourn and reconvene after the Fair Work Commission's annual wage review decision, and that was issued on the 6th of June. So we're here to hear any submissions you wish to make in that regard. Mr Hendrickson.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. The Fair Work Commission's determined that minimum and award wages in the national jurisdiction will be increased by 3.3% from the 1st of July. The Fair Work Commission's decision in the annual wage review was based on a range of economic, social and collective bargaining considerations. In particular, the Fair Work Commission noted that the prevailing economic circumstances provided an opportunity to improve the relative living standards of the low paid and to enable them to better meet their needs. The Minister notes that the Fair Work Commission's decision was influenced by a number of key business indicators at the national level that were fairly robust, including increased rates of profitability, productivity and real net national disposable income and falling real unit labour costs. Following the national annual wage review, the Minister reiterates support for a $19.20 per week increase in the state minimum wage and state award wages. It's submitted that the Minister's position in the state wage case is strengthened in light of the national decision for several reasons. The Minister's proposed adjustment represents a smaller increase to the state minimum and award wages than what has been determined for the national jurisdiction, which would reflect the more subdued conditions currently being experienced in Western Australia. The Minister's position would also contribute to a further narrowing of the gap between the full-time adult minimum wage for state employees and employees in the national jurisdiction. A $19.20 per week increase in the state minimum wage would be $3 less than the $22.20 per week increase determined for the national minimum wage. This difference will be greater in award rates of pay above the minimum, as the Minister is advocating for a flat dollar increase, which amounts to a lower percentage for higher award classifications. For instance, the Minister notes that a $19.20 per week increase would raise the C10 rate of pay in state awards to $811.10 per week, which would only be $2 per week above the new C10 rate in national awards. Importantly, however, the Minister's proposed increase would still provide a real wage increase for low-paid workers, helping to maintain a framework of fair wages and conditions of employment. The Minister's position in the state wage case therefore represents a fair and sustainable approach, which would contribute to improved living standards for workers while also taking account of prevailing local conditions. For these reasons, the annual wage review decision does not give rise to a change in the Minister's position in these proceedings. If it pleases the Commissioner Court session, that concludes the Minister's submission.
Thank you, Mr Hendrickson. Mr Moss.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. With respect to the annual wage review decision, the Fair Work Commission has chosen to provide a substantial increase to award wages, largely out of its concern that the previous growth had been too modest and that nationally the economic conditions allowed for such an increase. In essence, the Fair Work Commission has adopted the view that the improved economic circumstances nationally provide an opportunity to pass on greater increase to award-reliant employees, which is not dissimilar to the approach adopted by previous benches of the Commission in court session during the boom years with respect to the state wage case, where at the time the WA economy outperformed those of our East Coast counterparts. It is important to note that as a national decision, the economic conditions of the larger states, being New South Wales and Victoria, have had a significant impact on how the national economy is performing. The improved economic position of the East Coast, however, is not reflected in what's occurring within WA currently. The Fair Work Commission has identified that economic conditions have varied between states, with strong growth in New South Wales and Victoria and weaker growth in Western Australia, and that's at paragraph 39 of the decision. CCI is concerned about the impact of the Fair Work Commission's decision on low-paid workers covered by modern awards. In particular, we note that the Commission in court sessions comments in last year's decision noted the evidence of Mr Christmas, in which he identified that a real increase in state minimum wage by more than the wage price index would improve the relative attractiveness of higher paid labour relative to low paid labour, because it increases the price of labour by more than that of high paid labour. We're concerned that a 3.3% increase, where the private sector wage growth is just 1%, puts low paid workers at a disadvantage within the labour market, particularly given that businesses are still heavily focused in WA on controlling costs. In looking at the economic circumstances, the Fair Work Commission has focused heavily on the strength of the national economy, which, as demonstrated when we look at the WA Treasury's economic outlook, which was produced for the purpose of these proceedings, as well as CCI submissions, there's a significant difference in the performance of the WA economy compared with that of the national economy. Furthermore, the predictions of WA Treasury versus Federal Treasury as to where the economy is going is also markedly different.
That's always the case, isn't it, with federal decisions, because essentially it's aggregate national data which is the basis on which decisions are made.
Yes.
It's very difficult to tease out state circumstances. If you look at the decision, the Federal Commission the Fair Work Commission clearly acknowledged the strength of the New South Wales and Victorian economies. The conclusion is inescapable, isn't it, that those economies have pulled up the overall economic data.
Yes, quite correct, Senior Commissioner. In particular, if you look at New South Wales and Victoria, given that they're the most populous states, the performance of those two states, as you identified, it brings the national data along the lines of where those two economies are going. In essence, for want of a better term, skewing the results in that respect. So, and that is one of the things the Commission has recognised, the Fair Work Commission has recognised, is that economic performance is different between the states, and clearly New South Wales and Victoria are leading the charge in that respect. The Fair Work Commission noted that nationally business entrance versus exit margin had improved, and the proportion of new entrants being 14.6% of businesses compared to the exit rate of 12.3% had been a positive change, with a percentage difference of 2.3%. That's at table 4.3, page 59 of their decision. In WA, by comparison, the percentage difference is only 1.9%, with new entrants being lower at 14.4% and the exits being higher at 12.5%, and that's based on the ABS Council of Australian Business report. The Fair Work Commission also noted that nationally business survival rates have improved, paragraph 252 of their decision. In the case of WA, however, we continue to trail behind the national average, with a 4-yearly survival rate in WA being 61.7% compared to 62.1% nationally. Once again, that comes from the Council of Australian Business report. Reference was also had to business confidence levels having improved nationally at paragraphs 262. We reinforce the comments that we made at paragraph 3.75 of our submission in reply, that surveys such as the National Australia Bank Business Confidence Survey, which was cited by the Fair Work Commission, shows that business confidence in all other states and territories are in positive territory. Whilst for WA, business confidence is still in negative territory. This reinforces the divide between WA and the rest of the country. The Fair Work Commission has identified that inflation is low, at 2.1% nationally over the year to the March quarter. However, Perth's CPI is much lower than that, currently at 1% over the year to the March quarter 2017. In considering wage growth, the Fair Work Commission has identified that for businesses, private sector wage growth is a more relevant measure. That's paragraph 283 of their decision. In WA, private sector wage growth, as measured by the Wage Price Index, was 1% in the year to March 2017, compared to 1.7% nationally. The Fair Work Commission has also identified that nationally the unemployment rate has remained steady for several years, hovering around its current rate of 5.8%. In comparison, WA's trend unemployment rate is 6.1%, and our employment rate has been rising since 2012. Fair Work Commission also identified that nationally the underemployment rate has risen only a little. Once again, as identified in paragraph 3.11 of our main submission, the situation in WA is significantly different. We currently have a very high level of underemployment at 10.9% compared to 9% nationally, and it has been trending upwards. In looking at the needs of the low paid, and in particular wage inequality, the Fair Work Commission has identified that inequality in household disposable incomes has not risen as fast as that for earnings. And this is largely a result of the moderating factor that the tax transfer system has, as well as the composition and level of employment for households in paragraph 63 of their decision. This comment reinforces the role of the tax transfer system, and as well as the changing nature of family arrangements, means that the simple comparison between the minimum wage and average earnings is a too simplistic a measure for assessing relative living standards. As part of the national decision, much comment had also been made about the 60% benchmark determining poverty. In considering this issue, the Fair Work Commission identified that based on modelling of different household types, most households that have at least one person on the national minimum wage have disposable incomes above the 60% median household disposable income threshold, with the greatest margin being for a single parent with one child. And that's paragraph 64 of the decision. It reinforces the interrelationship between the minimum wage and the tax transfer system, meaning that neither tool is expected to fully address the needs of low-income earners. Both tools operate in conjunction with each other. They also note that the working family type with income below the 60% poverty line measure is that which includes an adult within the household who's not in the labour force. Now, for WA, this is particularly relevant given the high level of unemployment as well as underemployment, meaning that it's the labour market and not the minimum wage that's holding these households back. The circumstances for these households would be much improved if they had employment or additional employment opportunities. Hence, we believe the need to focus on ensuring that the minimum wage and award rates generally do not act as a barrier to employment is a significant issue of concern, particularly for WA in the current environment. We also know that the Fair Work Commission has identified in paragraph 461 of its decision that contemporary poverty line measures, such as the 60% benchmark, are a measure of inequality and is not based on observed incapacity of households to meet their needs, and that true poverty is best determined by measures of deprivation and financial stress. Fair Work Commission also notes that while poverty is a significant issue for society, it's not the role of the minimum wage to ensure that all households with a single wage earner exceed the 60% poverty indicator. In looking at the impact of minimum wage on employment, we do have some significant reservations about the Fair Work Commission's view that UK research into the effect of minimum wage increases is relevant in the Australian context. It's paragraph 70 of the decision. In particular, we note that the UK does not have a system of awards that result in multiple minimum wages having application to a far broader proportion of the population. As the Fair Work Commission has noted, while the UK minimum wage has increased at higher increments than the Australian minimum wage, it is still much lower than our minimum wage rates and does not set higher rates for skilled workers, as our award system does. The Fair Work Commission has also noted that in previous years it's been reluctant to draw heavily upon international research, and we see no reason or basis for this approach to change. We would also add that the Fair Work Commission approach to increasing modern award rates is based on its view that nationally the economy is growing with increased levels of optimism, giving the Fair Work Commission confidence that a high increase can be sustained. We don't believe this is the situation for WA, and hence our view is that a more conservative approach is needed in the context of the West Australian environment. In considering arguments of a consumer-driven recovery to the economy, the Fair Work Commission noted that the arguments raised by the ACTU that a significant increase in the minimum wage will generate increased economic growth, which has also formed the basis for submissions made as part of these proceedings. They identified that they are of the view that award increases would at best have a marginal effect on consumer demand, in paragraph 70. In particular, the Fair Work Commission accepted the submissions of various parties that the ACTU modelling is flawed and does not take into account the full range of factors that apply, paragraph 527 and 528 of their decision. In particular, they noted that the ACTU modelling doesn't take into account considerations of the impact of taking funds away from businesses, which is the source of wages. And those are comments that we sustain, that in essence you're, in the first aspect, increasing minimum wage, taking that funds out of the employer in order to pass it on to the employees, and the impact that things like taxation and wage costs, other wage costs, has on that. Importantly, the Fair Work Commission's views in consideration of this argument is framed very much against an estimated 2.3 million workers being directly affected by the annual wage review decision, which of course would have a much greater spending impact than the estimated 30,000 workers, or 2.2% of the WA workforce, directly affected by the state wage case decision. So consequently, on the premise that the Fair Work Commission saw little merit in that argument when it was working with larger numbers, I think is a fairly telling aspect with respect to the State Wage Commission, where the impact, direct impact on employees, is looking at more modest population. With respect to equal remuneration, the Fair Work Commission has also affirmed that bargaining and equal remuneration provisions within the Fair Work Act provide a more direct means of tackling the issue of equal remuneration, paragraph 78 of the decision. And this is very much in line with the views expressed by the Commission in court session in last year's state wage case decision. The Fair Work Commission also notes that award rates are structured to provide equal remuneration for work of equal value, both within and across awards, at paragraph 642. And the same, I think, can be said of the state award system. In looking at the basis for their increase, the key reason for the Fair Work Commission in granting percentage increase was due to concerns about compressed wage relativities and reduced gains from skill acquisitions. CCI believes that in the current environment, for WA, a flat dollar increase would be a more sustainable means of targeting the needs of the low paid, without putting greater pressure on overall employment costs that would arise from percentage increase. We note that the 3.3% increase granted by the Fair Work Commission would result in the national minimum wage increasing to $694.90 per week, being marginally higher than the current level of the state minimum wage. CCI believes that this does provide some scope for an increase to the state minimum wage and award rates of pay, but we would strongly caution against any increase above the current level of CPI. Given the limited ability for employers to pass on increased wage costs to consumers, CCI is concerned that any real increase to wages will force employers to reduce the available hours that they can offer staff, with small business owners working more hours to pick up the slack. May it please the Commission, court session, that's our submission.
Thank you,
Mr. Mosser, can you just repeat for me why you say that we shouldn't follow the Fair Work Commission in placing some reliance on the UK Low Pay Commission 2016 National Minimum Wages report that Mr Toomey took us to, and now it seems that the Fair Work Commission has been impressed by? It was that the UK does not have a system of awards, I think, was the main reason.
That's one of the key aspects. So first of all, it doesn't have a system of awards. And the awards, our award system means that the impact of the state wage case decision and the impact of the federal annual wage review decision has a much broader application. If the state wage case decision was only increasing the state minimum wage, its impact would be significantly smaller than the current model, which it increases all award rates of pay.
You yourself hold the concern about the increase in the minimum wage flowing through negotiations and otherwise across the workforce.
Yes, that is a concern for us.
So would not that same phenomenon play out in the UK?
I suspect not, or our view probably would be that it wouldn't, simply because it has far broader application. It's applying to a much smaller proportion of the workforce, whereas in the case of state and national wage case decisions, because it's having that direct impact on award wages, it has a far more significant effect. Our system of enterprise bargaining also has a far greater connection to the award system, either indirectly in the case of state Section 41 agreements, whereas there's no disadvantage or other test directly against the award. The awards strongly form the basis for those agreements, and more directly in the case of the federal bargaining, in that you have the better off overall test. Those two aspects ensure that bargaining is done in the context of awards being a relative instrument for the enterprise bargaining process. So that means that changes to awards are particularly relevant and particularly in the minds of people when they're negotiating agreements. So we would view that the signalling effect of decisions of this nature has a far greater implication.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Dr. Diamond.
May it please the Commission in court session. In the wake of the Fair Work Panel's decision, Unions WA's position on the increase to the state minimum wage remains unchanged. We continue to request an increase of $45 a week to award levels C14 to C10, with a 5.7% increase to the levels thereafter. There are some aspects of the national decision that Unions WA would like to highlight for the Commission's consideration that we think are relevant to state wage case considerations. Unions WA, as does the ACTU, welcomes a rise in wages in a situation where, as the Fair Work Panel notes in paragraph 7 of its statement, the prevailing economic circumstances provide an opportunity to improve the relative living standards of the low-paid and enable them to better meet their needs. Given that over the last 5 years, the real value of the national minimum wage and award rates of pay, or modern award rates, has grown at 4.3%, which is less than half the rate of growth in labour productivity. However, we would also join with the ACTU in condemning a situation in which low-wage earners continue to struggle to make ends meet in terms of basic living costs. This situation is establishing, we would see, an underclass of the working poor. As the panel points out in paragraph 11 of its statement, if the low-paid are forced to live in poverty, then their needs are not being met, and that those in full-time employment can reasonably expect a standard of living that exceeds poverty levels. The panel goes on to say that we acknowledge that an increase we propose to awards will not lift all award-reliant employees out of poverty, particularly those households with dependent children and a single wage earner. So in that sense, Unions WA, along with the ACTU, maintains that the panel has missed an opportunity to help business and boost employment via a substantial minimum wage increase, which the research cited in its decision show would not have the calamitous effects often ascribed to wage increases. Given that situation, that Western Australia and Australia as a whole has an unprecedented stagnation in wages across the board, combined with very strong profit numbers, if there was ever a year for the panel to be certainly more ambitious, this was it. In looking at the national decision, in the light of some of the considerations for the state wage order arising from Section 50A3 of the Act, ensuring that West Australians have a system of fair wages and conditions of employment, unfortunately, this national increase is not enough to close that growing gap between average and minimum wages that's putting enormous pressure on our lowest paid. Unions WA argues that the discussion of the evidence cited in the Fair Work Commission should have prompted a larger national wage increase, closer to that of the ACTU claim, to address the aforementioned growing gap or the reducing of the bite of the minimum wage compared to average weekly earnings. And in our initial submission to the state wage case, paragraph 6.2, Unions WA has highlighted this issue for both the national and WA minimum wages. In terms of the considerations for the State Commission to meet the needs of the low paid, the Fair Work Panel paragraph of their decision, paragraph 392, says that we think it clear that workers who receive the national minimum wage or modern award rate of pay are disproportionately located in the lower deciles of the relevant distribution of household income. Unions WA's initial submissions in our paragraph 4.19 and 4.20 make the point that the WA Commission should reject submissions that contend that minimum wage workers do not need a substantial pay increase because their living arrangements may be in a household with higher income earners. This is simply not the case. On the consideration for the State Commission to provide fair wage standards in the context of living standards generally prevailing in the community, in their paragraph 453 of their decision, the Fair Work Panel rejects claims advanced by employer groups that the minimum wage is nothing to do with income distribution. They go on to say, we do not accept this proposition. A consideration of the relative living standards of the low paid is essentially a consideration about income distribution. The relative standards of the low paid will fall even if their absolute standards remain constant, but the living standards of other relevant groups rise. On the State Commission's need to consider contributing to improved living standards for employees, in paragraph 489 of the Fair Work Decision Panel, there's a concession that, and I quote, higher levels of safety net pay increases will assist the low-paid individuals and families to better meet their needs and improve their relative standard of living. As a consequence, increasing the national minimum wage and modern award minimum wages will also have some effect in reducing poverty and inequality. However, in our view, the panel has not drawn what we would regard as the strong conclusion from that it should not preside over minimum wage adjustments that result in either falling or merely treading water in terms of minimum wage bites compared to average weekly earnings. Just as the WA Commission has led with maintaining a higher state than national minimum wage that takes account of, among other things, higher living costs in WA, so too it should take a lead in reversing the erosion of relative living standards of the low paid and so maintain a fair system of wages and conditions. On the State Commission's need to consider protecting employees who may be unable to reach an industrial agreement, once again for the Fair Work Panel, in its paragraph 633 of its decision, the panel observes that available research does not reveal any particular relationship between the incentive to bargain and increases in the national minimum wage and modern award minimum wages. Instead, it points to a complex set of factors that may contribute to employee and employer decision-making about whether or not to bargain. So Unions WA would argue that in a system of free collective bargaining, it is up to the parties involved to enter into agreements that best suit their needs. The Industrial Relations Act asks the State Commission to protect employees who are unable to undertake this process. It does not ask the Commission to anticipate bargaining outcomes across Western Australia or Australia as a whole. In terms of the State Commission's consideration, the need to encourage ongoing skills development. Once again, in the Fair Work Panel's decision, paragraph 583, the panel cites a research report, Factors Affecting Apprenticeships and Traineeships, which was published in February 2017, which concluded that the change in availability of government subsidies notably for existing workers and part-time workers in some occupations, clearly contributed to the decline in apprenticeship and traineeship commencement rates. And that while the apprentices' decision to increase apprentices' wages may have played a role, it seems that the effect is minor given the prevalence of over-award payments to apprentices and the lack of uniformity in commencement trends across individual trades. This part of the report concluded that employers are becoming increasingly less enamoured with the apprenticeship and traineeship model. But having regard to those conclusions, we, the panel, do not consider that the material before us calls for any differential treatment of apprentices and trainees in order to enhance workforce participation and social inclusion. On the need for the State Commission to provide equal remuneration for men and women for work of equal and comparable value. Once again, in paragraph 78 of the panel's decision, they say that in relation to the gender pay gap, women are disproportionately represented among the low paid, and hence an increase in minimum wages is likely to promote gender pay equity. They go on to say, increases in minimum wages, particularly percentage adjustments that might exceed increases evident through bargaining, are more likely to have a beneficial impact that is broader than would be the case if flat wage increases were applied to lower classification levels. This is because of the dispersion of women within the ward classification structures and the greater propensity for women to be paid award wages at all levels. So Unions WA asks the WA Commission to bear this in mind when considering the structure of our claim, once again $45 per week flat amount at the lower levels and a 5.7% increase to levels afterwards. We would once again reiterate our argument that that type of increase balances delivering the larger proportionate increase to the lower paid while preserving the pre-existing skills relativities for award classifications. On the State Commission's need to consider the economy of Western Australia and the likely effect of its decision on things like on levels of employment, inflation, productivity. The Fair Work panel states that it's paragraph 14 of its decision. In the current review, our consideration of international research on the impact of increases in the minimum wages on employment, particularly United Kingdom research, has fortified our view that modest and regular wage increases do not result in disemployment effects. Further, that research suggests that the panel's past assessments of what constitutes quote-unquote modest increase may have been overly cautious in terms of its assessed disemployment effects. So in that sense, Unions WA reiterates the point that has been made by WACOS, which we supported in our additional submissions, paragraphs 3.12 and 3.13, that the WA Commission has been warned fairly regularly about the potentially dangerous impacts of employment on raising the state minimum wage by too much, and once again there's not real evidence that such impacts have really come to pass. For the Commission's requirement to consider, to the extent that it's relevant, the state of the national economy, look, the panel, Fair Work panel states in its paragraph number 40 of its decisions, business conditions generally look quite healthy. Profitability grew by a strong 26% for all industries and is still a strong 10% for all non-mining industries over the past year. As a result, the profit share of factor income has risen. Now, Unions WA's initial submission, paragraph 11.3, we noted that the most recently released NAB Business Confidence Survey for April 2017 reported that April had a particularly strong result, with both business conditions and confidence improving, pointing to ongoing growth in business activity in the near term, in addition to elevated levels of business conditions. Improvements appear to have become increasingly broad-based across states and industries, and that includes a improvement in WA. So with that, to that extent, the panel also notes in its paragraph 227 of its decision that it continues to support an conclusion that increases in minimum wages are more likely to stimulate productivity measures by some employers directly affected by minimum wage increases rather than inhibit productivity.
Sorry, could you refer me to that paragraph again?
Oh, sorry. So that is paragraph 227
Yes, thank you.
in the panel decision.
Thank you.
So moving on to the considerations of the State Commission, to the extent that is relevant, the capacity of employers as a whole to bear the costs of increased wages, salaries, allowances and other remuneration. The panel has noted in paragraph 44 of its decision, noting the Reserve Bank of Australia statement that growth in nominal unit labour costs has been lower than Australia's major trading partners, and concludes that the differences in these growth rates of Australia's unit labour costs compared to those of its trading partners have led to a more marked improvement in Australia's labour competitiveness and the competitiveness of its goods and services. Okay. And this is corroborated by national accounts data released a few days ago, which showed that real unit labour costs fell sharply in the year to March, while productivity spiked in the private sector. The data showed that real non-farm unit labour costs increased by about 2.5% in the quarter and 5.9% over 12 months, while gross value added per hour worked in the market sector, that's a measure of productivity, increased by 1.7% in the year to March, in trend terms, after rising by 0.4 in the quarter. The Fair Work panel goes on to note in its paragraph 268 that the Australian government, in its submissions to the Fair Work decision, on the basis of NAB and census surveys, concluded, among other things, that the proportion of small businesses that experienced an improvement in business conditions over the December 2016 quarter outweighed the proportion of those that had experienced deterioration. But consistent with the NAB small to medium enterprise survey, the census results suggested that small business conditions continue to improve. And that the NAB survey certainly show that small businesses are now reporting better conditions than all businesses in general. The census December quarter 2016 business index, which includes small and medium-sized businesses, shows encouraging signs of improvement in the labour market as well. Moving on for the considerations of the State Commission, the need to ensure that the West Australian award framework represents a fair system of wages and conditions. We would reiterate, I guess, the point that the panel makes in paragraph 99 of its decision. Past flat dollar increases in minimum wages have compressed award relativities and reduced the gains from skill acquisition. In doing so, classification structures designed to properly remunerate work according to its value and assure that equal minimum rates are provided for work of equal or comparable value, both within and across awards, have been distorted to a degree. And once again, we'd reiterate our point. For Unions WA's the structure of Unions WA's increase, $45 per week at the lower level, percentage increase at the higher level, best balances the range of factors that the Commission needs to take into account in that regard. In terms of the Commission's need to take into account relevant decisions of other industrial courts and tribunals, in its paragraph 30 of its decision, the Fair Work panel notes that its penalty rates decision on hospitality and retail awards in the national system, the decision on that does form part of the broad factual matrix against which the annual wage review is conducted, and to a limited extent we have taken that into account. Now, while the WA Commission obviously makes its decision on state awards, Unions WA argues that it should be mindful of the need to maintain consumer and household spending overall in WA, particularly during a period of low to no wage growth. Unions WA notes that the release by the ACTU of a McKell Institute report on the impact of Sunday penalty rate reductions in regional and rural Australia and WA, a potential loss of take-home income from penalty rate cuts will be around $46 million a year. Now, penalty rate cuts, we would argue, would do real harm to working people in our regions and further weaken national economies. And while they might be affecting different sections of workers, there's a question of the overall reduction in spending power in these areas, which the Commission should take into account as a danger or a problem if it does not deliver a substantial increase to the state minimum wage.
So you're suggesting that in some way the state minimum wage and increases in award wages should compensate the economy for the loss of penalty rates that come through the federal award system and the federal...
To the extent that it can, recognising, of course, all parties do, the smaller nature of the state system in that regard. It remains our case that the stimulatory or demand effects of an increase to minimum wages, even at the state minimum wage, should be taken into account. And in that sense, I might add, while there was discussion earlier about the weight that the Federal Commission put on the ACTU's argument on the multiplier effect, I'd nevertheless point out at paragraph 528 of the federal decision that the panel nevertheless said, nonetheless, the ACTU submission makes the important point that increases to the national minimum wages and award wages are likely to have some effect on consumer demand, and that needs to be taken into account. And indeed, following on from that, Unions WA points to the Reserve Bank's most recent statement on its monetary policy decision that came out on the 6th of June. Slow growth in real wages is restraining growth in household consumption. And that goes to the points that we made in our initial submission, where we reiterated the point made by the Federal Treasurer, who has declared low wage growth to be the biggest threat facing the Australian economy. And we would argue that it's no less the case in Western Australia. Given the current economic climate, in which there's pressure pushing against wages growth, there is a clear economic case for raising minimum wages as a tool for wage growth. Economists generally recognise low-wage workers are more likely than any other income group to spend any extra earnings on previously unaffordable basic needs and services. And we would regard that as significant given the importance of boosting household consumption as a component of the economy. So to that end, Unions WA continues to request an increase of to the state minimum wage and award wages of $45 per week for award levels C14 to C10 and a 5.7 increase to levels thereafter. And that concludes our submissions on this matter, and we are happy to take any questions from the Commission in Court session.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond.
Thank you.
Mr. Toomey.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to help the Commission with its deliberations. I note that my colleague Dr. Diamond seemed to have highlighted some of the same quotes. I won't go through and repeat them. I thought it was quite promising to see that the discussion that we'd had at the last session had gone along very similar lines to what we've seen come out of the federal wage case, particularly in the reflections around international research, some of the discussion on labour productivity, the issues of the wage fight, poverty inequality, and the gender pay gap, many of which have been referred to earlier. And so certainly that issue around the considerations of the findings from the UK, I think that there is some very clear evidence there. I noted that my colleague from CCI was making some assertions and interpretations about how different the potential impact might be. I don't necessarily agree with those views. I think there's certainly some uncertainty around there, whereas there is some quite clear evidence there, and certainly the federal case seemed very convinced that modest and regular wage increases do not result in disemployment effects, and I thought that was quite a strong conclusion there. And certainly, so there were those issues there at paragraphs 14 and 70 and 71. There's quite a good discussion there. Similarly to the issues around labour productivity, I thought it was interesting to see where they'd said at paragraph 42 and at 227 around the real gap between the growth in productivity versus the growth in wages. And certainly we believe that there is quite a gap there that we should be looking to catch up. I thought the discussion around the wage bite at paragraph 59, and there was also a chart there, I think at chart 1.2 on page 15, also kind of highlighted that gap that we'd seen there. And one of the things that they'd said in their deliberations, you know, they'd looked at the drop in the wage bite over the last decade, and they'd also compared Australia, saying it had a lower growth in the national minimum wage than New Zealand, France, the UK, US and Canada have had over this period. And similarly, there was also the discussion around inequality at paragraph 61, where they talk about a substantial rise in earnings distribution in the last decade. And there's that chart 5.7 on page 116. I feel all of those issues were significant ones that are worth considering. I also wanted to note in that discussion around the international research that what had been said in the paragraph following that around consumer demand, they had not actually said it was marginal or said that there was little merit. What they had said is some positive but possibly small. And so they'd gone on to say that was a consideration. It was a small one, but it was one of the factors that they considered in their decision. So I just wanted to clarify that. Similarly, on the discussion around the gender pay gap, they acknowledged women disproportionately among the low paid and said quite clearly that an increase in the national minimum wage is likely to promote gender pay equity. And similarly, they said that the grant of a uniform percentage adjustment was consistent with the equal remuneration principle. So I think those things came through quite clearly in the arguments that they put ahead there. I think really they're the main things that I wanted to highlight. I won't go and repeat some of the arguments that have been there, but I'm quite happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Turney.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your additional submissions. We'll take those into account. Decisions reserved, and we will provide it to you as soon as we possibly can. Thank you. We'll adjourn.